Let's talk about some things related to the period of the Greeks and Romans. Now, there'll be some places here where we will find some similarities. There'll be some places here where I'm kind of setting the stage because there'll be some places that will influence Christianity down the road. And Christianity will appeal to some Greek philosophies, for example, in order to try and make sense to the Greeks and Romans, some particular Christian teaching. But then also kind of the contrast. What are Christians working against as they start spreading their message? One of the things to focus on here is religion. What was the religious culture like in Greece and Rome and the empire at this time? Well, a lot of religion was focused on deities and connecting with the gods and goddesses. Quite different understandings of deities than when you think about what we talk about with the Jewish discussion of God. In many ways, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, mirrored human beings. Their social relationships, their activities. They got married, they got divorced, they fought, they got angry, they got upset. If you could think of the worst of society, the gods did that as well. Right? All sorts of sexual relationships. Zeus indiscriminately had children with all sorts of human beings, despite him being married to Hera. So the gods were not necessarily moral examples for the Romans or the Greeks. But you did want them on your side. Right? You wanted them because they would help you have good crops or succeed in business or, bear healthy children. And so there was this idea within a lot of polytheistic societies that you need to get the gods on your side. Or if they're angry with you, you need to assuage their anger. It wasn't like the Christian view of God or even the Jewish view of God of God's desire to do these things. It's kind of the exact opposite. You need to make the gods feel like they should help you out. The Romans especially thought of themselves as being under obligation to the deities, which is also kind of how they're starting to picture what it means to relate to the emperor. There are obligations that you have to the emperor. There are obligations you have to the deities, and so you must perform those. The Greeks and the Romans, of course, believed in existence after death. There was some notion of rewards and punishments, but it was all part of the underworld, where you either ended up in the Elysian fields, perhaps, or you just ended up in Hades, or you might end up in some sort of punishment. One of the things that the Greeks especially talked about was the immortality of the soul. That the soul was immortal, that it existed prior to physical existence, it existed after a physical existence. The soul cannot be created or destroyed. We'll talk more about that in some other places. Very important within the religion, of course, was the arena of experts, priests, or others were often used or appropriated in order to participate in religion. Also very important for the Greeks and Romans were the customs of the ancestors. Now, we're not talking about ancestor worship like what we would see in traditional Chinese religion, for example, where you offer sacrifices to the ancestors. But there is that idea of you keep alive what the ancestors have done. Now, there's some cases where it does border on ancestor worship, but there is that maintaining of the things that have been done in your family previously. While there was a lot of diversity in religious views among Rome, Greece, there are some characteristics that are important for us to note, especially in thinking about what does Christianity represent to this world. First of all, especially Roman religion was not exclusive. If you worshiped one deity, you can worship others as well. And so your particular family or a trade that you were involved in might be connected with a specific god or gods. But that didn't bind you to that person. You could worship other gods and goddesses as well. So, here is Judaism and then later Christianity saying there is but one God, you worship Him alone and worship no one else. That's odd to the Greeks and the Romans, because just because you worship one God doesn't mean you can't worship the others. Also, both Greek and Roman religion tended to be syncretistic. A blending occurred, right? Especially as these other places were conquered. Right? Zeus and Jupiter are the same god, or Zeus or Jupiter and some other god conquered is the same god. And so this identification made between these. Now, it's not always clear-cut. Certainly, sometimes things had to be bent a little bit. So that this particular Roman god kind of matches this Greek god, but there's some things that this Roman god is connected with, the Greek god wasn't connected with, but the idea is you really try to put them together. And so this identification of deities, the borrowing and transferring of ideas, makes very fluid. On the other hand, there were a couple of things that did push Roman religion, especially towards monotheism, and one was just the worship of power. And something centralized. And so it was, for some people it was less about worshiping the deities than it was harnessing power. And I think in some respects we can kind of see this in Acts chapter 8 of Simon the Sorcerer. Right? People are seeing him as he's connected to the great power, right? The power that was called great. It's about this power. And really that kind of traps Simon so that when he sees the apostles laying on hands and sharing the Spirit, right, he wants that. Why? Because he's been so focused on tapping into power rather than necessarily connecting with a deity. Also prominent with a lot of Roman culture at the time was looking at virtues as deities. As if there weren't enough already, we'll add some more. And so you have liberty, victory, justice, and there's peace, and there's all sorts of these things that become gods and goddesses. The belief was that these qualities must have come from the gods so that there must be gods that are extending these benefits. But as I mentioned, there's also a monotheistic impulse that we see. And so on the one hand, yes, we do see this kind of proliferation of deities. They're kind of cropping up all over. On the other hand, there were some trends within Greek and Roman religion towards monotheism. Part of the thing that happened when you identified deities was that you kept the numbers low. Right? And so instead of just adding Zeus and Hermes and Hera, by keeping them the same, you kept your numbers low. Worshipping power also shifted away from this pluralism. And then also the philosophers. Many of the Greek philosophers also tended to be monotheistic. They tended to criticize the gods rather than support the idea of gods. Also prominent in all of this is the presence of demons. Demons for the Greeks and Romans, however, were not necessarily evil spiritual beings, but simply beings intermediate between the gods and the humans. Right? And so a little higher than humans, less than the gods.
Kind of stuff between angels and demons, or kind of both.
Yeah, I mean, certainly they could be positive. They still often the demon's effect on your life was negative, but more it was understood as kind of like you're just unlucky, rather than it being fully evil. Very important as well was the idea of fate. Human beings were governed by fate. Right? There's fate, not fate, fate. Almost a determinism here. And really the encouragement was that you accepted your faith and you didn't try to work against it. Finally, a lot of Greek and Roman religion tends to be corporate rather than individual, meaning that you are part of a group. Now that might be your family, right? Your family might worship a specific god, might be a city, perhaps even the empire, in a variety of situations. But worship was often done in collective ways rather than individual ways. Although there was certainly individual religion as well. Questions about any of these characteristics? Anything I need to clarify? So on the one hand, you had religion. On the other hand, you had philosophy. Religion, of course, had its place in Rome, but for much of the intellectual content we associate with religion, people turned to philosophy rather than religion. It was philosophy that provided guidance on a way of life, especially for the elites who had the luxury of taking the time to study it. It was philosophy that provided people with direction and thinking about what a good life is. That kind of thing didn't appear in religion as often. If you wanted to know what was the moral thing to do, you turned to a philosopher. You didn't go to a priest to discuss the nature of reality or what the good life was. Ferguson says that philosophy provided the conscience of the age. And so it's that aspect that helps people connect with ethics, which was often the focus of a lot of philosophers. And one of the things that you can, if you compare and contrast Greek philosophers, one of the clearest places that they differed was on what constitutes right living, what is the end of life or the aim of life. And so philosophers would encourage people to adopt a particular viewpoint. They would lay out moral rules, and they would encourage people to good living. And just like the rabbis gathered at schools, so too did the philosophers. Often, though, people would just kind of get the popularized form. And so a lot of the common people just kind of looked at all philosophy as the same. But schools would develop under these philosophers and then these students would then propagate the philosophers' teachings. There's three philosophical schools that are important for the history of Christianity. And so I want to just kind of briefly talk about some of them. There's a lot more that we could say about them. But the first that I think is an important development is Platonism. Platonism will have an effect on Christianity, especially as we get into the Middle Ages. And it's a lot of people trying to find places where Christian teaching and Platonic philosophy agree that will lead to some changes. One of the big ones is the issue of the immortality of the soul. And this is one aspect of Platonism that gets a lot of currency within Christianity. When you look in the Bible, the New Testament does not teach the immortality of the soul. The New Testament teaches resurrection of body. But due to the influence of Platonism, particularly Neoplatonism, Christians have started talking about immortality of the soul. And so that's been the way a lot of people have talked about it. So here's one area that there's influence. But what Plato meant about this was that the soul has always existed. It existed before physical existence. It will continue after death as well. And it's completely distinct and separate from the body for Plato. Another place that Plato was useful, along with some other philosophers, is that Plato criticized the old gods. The old gods were driven by their appetites or their emotions. But reason, of course, was much more important, especially for Plato. Every time I say Plato, I always feel like I'm saying Plato, like that stuck you. But the arguments that he would use against the Greek and Roman gods, often early Christians would, as they were facing these Roman arguments or these Roman attacks, they would turn Plato's arguments back at them. And so that's where this became useful. Plato was one of those that wasn't monotheistic. There was one supreme being. However, like most Greek philosophers, this monotheistic God tended to be one who was separate, wasn't really involved in human life, and so often the God that the philosophers talked about was impersonal. There really wasn't a connection between human beings and God. Also important for later Christians was Plato's view on ideas. His belief that ideas had a real existence in a realm that was separate from the physical. Often this is referred to as the world of forms. And so we have this view of what an ideal circle would be. That ideal circle exists in this world of forms, even though it might not ever exist physically. And so this idea of courage being real in this other world, that's why we can talk about courage here, because it really exists in some other realm. Now, while most Christians wouldn't necessarily go that route, the idea of the reality of the afterlife or the supernatural world could be a way to kind of connect with pagans. And so some people connected that way. But what that does is it diminishes the importance of this world. Because you're so, that's the real world and this isn't, almost. Another important philosophy for early Christians was that of Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Cyprus. It got its name from Stoa being a porch, and so Zeno taught on a porch, and so it was called Stoa or Stoicism. Stoics had a very high view of morality. The goal of life is virtue. And that is what you're wanting to achieve, is a virtuous life. Which means you have to live very, very carefully rightly. Particularly because there is a law that pervades nature. There's a rational principle. And so we should be, as human beings, trying to live according to that law, live according to that principle. People should live according to reason, or logos. To live this way is to live according to the law of nature. Now, the idea of the logos becomes very important for Christians. In the beginning was the logos, right? John 1:1. And so those early Christian philosophers will try to use this area to kind of connect with people, pagans, around Jesus. But what John meant when he's talking about Jesus as the logos is not what Stoics meant when they talk about the logos. Okay? Very impersonal, very separate from that personal word that John talks about. The Stoics favored the rational life. The reason, very important to make judgments, to live rightly. That's preferable to the emotions. They did not believe in a personal God. They did talk about God, but often God was more what we might say pantheistic. And the presence of God is in everything, rather than a personal God who is distinct from creation.